When I was little, I had these cassette tapes. 50 classic cartoons. Most of them were way before my time, as they seemed to be from that golden age of animation back in the 1940s. Many of them still had those old racist stereotypes that would blush to show on TV now, and a lot of them were thinly veiled American propaganda. I seem to remember one being a Superman cartoon where there wasn't any real story, just Superman sneaking off at night to terrorize Japanese bases and harbors, crippling their war efforts. Many of the gags were confusing to me, but I enjoyed them just the same, as 90% of all good cartoons are highly visual absurdities and gags. But for some reason, one joke in particular stuck with me. Fallen Hair is a merry melody from 1943 starring Bugs Bunny. The entirety of the short is Bugs Bunny trying to get back at a gremlin, an obnoxious little character that's trying to destroy a military airplane. The last gag in the cartoon involves the plane plummeting from the sky, then sputtering to a stop about a foot above the ground, with the characters lamenting that they ran out of gas.
We ran out of gas.
Then Bugs Bunny says,
You know how it is with these A-cards.
Big Finish outro. Growing up, that joke stuck with me because no, I did not know how it was with those A cards. I wasn't even sure what an A card was, or maybe I was just mishearing it. This one stuck out to me because even though many of those old cartoons made homage or reference to singers or actors at the time, those were always clearly indicated to me to be jokes that I simply wouldn't get because they were references to things long past. The A-card joke was one that had to tie in intimately with the gag of the plane running out of gas and defying gravity, so it was infuriating to me that I could only get half the joke, but not the other half. It wasn't until I was much older that I learned about the fuel rationing cards and designations of World War II, and Bugs was referencing the issue that many Americans must have felt at the time of never having enough gas because their vehicle was designated only to receive so much gas. Understanding that does improve the joke a little. Both the absurdities that it was the gas running out that suspends the plane in the air as though one needed fuel for gravity to work, and the gag that they ran out because of the fuel designation card, despite the plane being a military aircraft that obviously should have as much fuel as it requires. But the joke's just not funny to me, not just because I'm bitter and jaded and only laugh at real tragedy, but because I had to do research on what made the joke funny at the time, and it's just not simply the case anymore. Gary Larson, the creator of the Far Side cartoons, tried to explain comedy and how it works in our brains. The key element in any attempt at humor is conflict. Our brain is suddenly jolted into trying to accept something that is unacceptable. The punchline of a joke is the part that conflicts with the first part, thereby surprising us and throwing our synapses into some kind of fire drill. And the emotional response to this kind of conflict can range from laughter to a broken nose. In any humorous vehicle, this conflict, whether subtle or blunt, is mandatory. Using this as a primer, it's simple to see why a key element in comedy is timing and understanding, or not understanding as the joke requires. Our brain has to accept the unacceptable break from what we've been conditioned to accept as normal, and it has to happen at the right timing. Too fast, and we don't get the joke. Too slow, and we arrive at what should be the jarring conclusion early and have to wait for our assumptions about the future to be proven correct. Most visual gags rely on exactly this formula. We see someone get hit by a hammer. This is not a funny situation in reality, broken bones and blood are sure to follow, but surprise, they're more or less alright, but just making funny faces and stumbling around. And instead of the expected meaty crack of his skull being cracked open, there's like a boing kind of noise, or even funnier, a hollow coconut noise. We enjoy this comedy as it plays in our understanding of that world. That's where Falling Hair, well, falls. If you're born after the fuel rationing of World War II, you don't have any expectation of what a fuel rationing card is, or where you'd expect to find one. You can enjoy the gag of the plane stopping midair as it flies in the face of the expected crash, but you cannot enjoy the gag of the A card because there is no clash in the brain to accept the unacceptable, since you have no background on why it should be acceptable. You can get the background on it, but by then, the joke is dead. The sudden jarring sensation your brain needed to have for the joke to hit home is gone, and as you explain why the joke is funny, it makes it less funny. You're being explained why such an absurdity could not actually exist, which undermines your brain's attempted acceptance of the absurdity, and instead of helping you to accept it, you're further set in the conscious understanding that it cannot possibly exist. Having such a background in old-timey comedy, I thought I'd run into more jokes and gags in the silent comedy era of movies that were simply unfunny to my jaded and bitter mind, or just flew past me as I missed the understanding that I'd need to have to get the joke. Not every joke hit the mark, but more often than not, they did. And I'd like to take examples from 3 classic silent comedy era films, One Week, The Gold Rush, and Safety Last, and explain gags that work and why they work, and also some of the gags that I feel didn't work and why that is. Now this might seem like a fruitless effort as I'm trying to objectively explain something that is extremely subjective, and even as I do so, I'll be undermining the comedy that is there. But I hope that some future filmmaker can look at this video essay and understand humor and comedy a bit better in this analysis. Buster Keaton started in 1920's One Week, an absurd comedy about the foibles of a newlywed couple trying to build a house. This was the first silent era film that I was surprised about how much I enjoyed. A lot of the gags are timeless in the sense that everything you need to know about the gag is included inside the world that the film portrays. Only a few of the gags rely on outside references, and those are usually common sense kinds of things, like pianos are heavy. Now, remember that rule of comedy, a conflict with the viewer's assumptions. With that in mind, let's watch this classic gag. What makes this funny? Let's look at the assumptions that we'd have going into this scene. 1. The woman will be naked in the bath. 2. She will have to expose herself in order to retrieve the soap. 3. Films cannot show gratuitous nudity. We're given a moment of shock here when we're confronted with our assumptions. She's going to have to exit the bath, and we don't see a way around it. Then we see the conflict in our assumptions, and we see a fourth assumption that we didn't even think about. 4. The film will always protect suspension of disbelief. The film goes out of its way to reaffirm the 3 assumptions that we had, the relief of which lowers the tension, but then conflicts with the 4th, which results in hilarity. However, one of the less funny gags comes later in the film where Buster Keaton is trying to get back into the house, which is now spinning like a top in a windstorm. The entirety of the gag is about 2 minutes long, which is far longer than most jokes should be. Our assumptions going into this gag is 1. A house is stationary. Now, the gag is funny as the house spins, but the timing is all wrong. The conflict happens, but we're given more time to process the conflict, which has us change our viewpoint. Oh, well, I guess some houses do spin. From there, we lose that sudden jolt that Gary Larson talked about, and the only real payoff you get for the length of the gag is something of a pun at the end. Length of gags is what I usually find to be the main offenders in older comedy. While understanding that film as a comedic medium was something new and that stories in life moved slower back then, I can make rationalizations on why that may have been funny in 1920, but that doesn't help me enjoy the comedy any more than learning about fuel rationing cards. Another example of a gag that goes on too long comes from 1925's Gold Rush, with none other than Charlie Chaplin. Near the end of the film, this snow shack is pushed near the edge of a cliff. In a visual gag surprisingly similar to Buster Keaton's, the house starts tipping back and forth over the brink. Our assumptions in this gag are the same as the last. 1. A house is stationary. Now in this role, the conflict is trying to work a dual purpose. It's building suspense and tension. Is the tramp going to fall down the cliff with the house? But it's also trying to be comedic with the blatant absurdity of the entire piece. The house, instead of breaking apart in half or just coming down around their ears, is remarkably staying together, and the weight of what's inside of it is what will determine whether or not the house leads to ruin or stays safe. But just like Keaton's gag, this one goes on too long. The comedy is gone after the first few moments, long before the comedy turns into dire circumstance, and the tension, for most modern viewers anyway, is lost as you know that if there was a film where the tramp died, you'd probably have heard about it by now. The comedic conflict is gone too soon, but the film keeps telling the same joke. This breeds apathy in the viewer, that is to say, they lose interest in what happens next. For me and my friends as we watched the film, we found it easier and easier to become distracted through many of the gags, as we became to understand that we could look away from the film for a few minutes, come back, and then still be on that same tired gag. I'm sure that people were more patient back in 1925, and all of this may have seemed brand new to them, but that shift in time spent paying attention is what can cause a joke to lose efficiency over time. On the other hand, parts where Chaplin acts the clown are hilarious. Earlier in the film, he's in the same cabin, but he's starving with his bunkmate. Looking at our assumptions, we have 1. Candles don't taste good. 2. Eating a candle should be a distasteful experience. Obviously, both of these are in conflict with the apparent apathy with which the tramp eats the candle. The deadpan way he consumes it only adds to the humor, as one would expect that if someone were hungry enough to eat a candle, that they might show some emotion, either distaste or the other extreme of finding it delicious. But here he is, eating it with the same reaction as someone eating a sandwich while engrossed in a book. In 1923, Harold Lloyd starred in Safety Last, which may be my favorite silent era comedy thus far. One thing that this film understands If you want to keep using the same joke, you need to be able to build on it and not just retell it from a different angle. The fluidity is where the conflict arises in this gag. Our assumptions are that 1. A parking ticket is cause for pause, and 2. Someone who just cost someone else a parking ticket would stick around for a little bit. This is a joke that works today, as all of the elements are still present. There are still cars, policemen, parking tickets. In fact, one of the reasons I think this joke works even better by today's standards is that it might be surprising to know that such things existed even in 1923. The climax of the film, where Lloyd climbs the building, is where this movie shines. Like the previous two examples, it features a set piece of a building, both as a source of comedy and as a source of peril. But where 1 week in the Gold Rush failed, this one succeeds by ramping up the tension with each floor he scales. Each floor has a new element that puts his safety at risk. Whether it be birds, dogs, a net, or even getting shot at, despite the core of the tension remaining the same, the details vary enough to keep you engrossed. The reason I've determined that these older movies still hold up today is because filmmakers rarely took for granted what a viewer might understand coming into the movie. Each movie was a small, enclosed world wherein the jokes would take place. This meant any element that was needed for a joke to work would be introduced before the gag ever took place. Popular culture references were scarce. The disappointing thing with today's more modern humor is that it's very referential. Many gags are references to other movies or current events, which means that in another 50 years, my children will be watching cartoons I grew up with and have the same issues I had with that Bugs Bunny cartoon so long ago.